back. You've found your way to Spotlight on key tourism topics, building sustainability into tourism recovery, sponsored by Wine Growers of Canada. The session explores opportunities to rebuild our industry from the ground up and asks, how can we integrate sustainability into these efforts?
To tell you more about how you can make a difference in your destination, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Megan Epler-Wood, one of the pioneers of the sustainable tourism movement. Megan is a thought leader and a consultant on questions of managing sustainable tourism. She has led her firm Epler-Wood International since 2003 to design regional sustainable and ecotourism development projects in 18 countries. She presently leads research and coursework for Harvard and Cornell universities. She visited Banff, the Yukon, and British Columbia between 2018 and 2020 to give keynote presentations on her 2017 book, Sustainable Tourism on a Finite Planet, and her 2019 report, Destinations at Risk, The Invisible Burden. Her new work on a Marshall Plan for Tourism became the focus of the Pacific Asia Travel Association Roundtable in 2020 on building sustainable finance mechanisms for the COVID-19 recovery. Megan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Blake, for having me, and thanks, TIAC, for bringing me to this first virtual event. It's got to be a thrill to have 450 people sitting in, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to give a short presentation, and we hope to really engage you in some dialogue afterwards. So, you know, as Blake mentioned, I visited the Yukon, which this is a picture of, just a little over a year ago, and British Columbia not long after that, and Banff beforehand. So I've had the, you know, the honor and pleasure of seeing these areas, and now with the pandemic, getting the chance to think about, well, how can we use some of the research that my firm and my team at Harvard and Cornell have been doing to apply to the recovery in rural Canada? One of the things from, you know, the business perspective that I'm fascinated by is how downturns can lead to good things, even in business. Obviously, it's extremely frightening to see 1.8 million people's jobs at risk in Canada right now, with about 70% of all small and medium enterprises in distress. Nothing could be worse. But at the same time, there is, in this process of tearing things down in an unplanned way, the opportunity to rebuild them in an innovative and creative way. And that's what I've been learning in all of our discussions to date throughout the world. So in Canada, of course, we're already learning through this conference how much interest there is in rural destinations and parks. Parks Canada just gave their presentation, even though it's Canadian tourism is down overall for parks. In parks near metro areas, it's way up. And so I think as we slowly see, say, you know, the border opening up again with the US, or international travel beginning, or even Canadian tourism next spring, we're going to see even more demand for these natural areas. And so therefore, it's time to get ready and think how to reinforce sustainability in all of these spectacular regions. So I recommend an action plan. I don't think it can be done province by province. I'm very much a person that believes that with some guidelines and guidance, national guidance, an action plan could be put in place that would help to rebalance priorities on a province by province level to make sure that nature tourism is, you know, really built even more into the mix, not only in the parks that are doing, of course, a terrific job, but outside the parks to reinforce the capacity for that public-private planning that we all know is so essential. And so then if that action plan were to start to at least roll out some opportunities for revamping what's happening now, the first thing I think most people would agree would be needed is more training, and also an understanding that management costs have to be incorporated into the process of rebuilding. You can't, I think there's a lot of thought that maybe you can just throw money at problems, right? Which in the pandemic is understandable why so many are just trying to get the money out the door. But we need more management, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. How could that management work so that the funds flow and they're very targeted by way of how that recovery and sustainability could be built in? And also, it must be said that indigenous needs in rural areas could become a preeminent part of this process. So just a quick review of the work that my team has done. We looked at, before the COVID-19 emergency, sustainability at the destination level in this publication, The Invisible Burden, which you can download for free on the Travel Foundation site. And what we found is like a very, I'd say, well-accepted set of concepts now that travel and tourism, both at the government level and the business level, have lacked the ability to do proper accounting of what the costs are for sustainability. And one of the reasons for that is that we're not measuring in a consistent manner to meet international agreements, such as the SDG goals and the Paris Agreement goals. They really, most governments, and that would include Canada, are not looking at what is the greenhouse gas emissions from the tourism economy. This is not yet part of our metric system. But I would argue, and this certainly this publication argues, that we need this kind of accounting to fully understand what's happening, in addition to the sociocultural look at how to preserve local cultures as part of a system of accounting for destinations of the future. So how would that work? Well, to be frank, we need to really change a little bit how our governance works. We at Harvard are actually looking at that intensively. We know here what the main focus is to date, which you can see in the chart on the right, which is from The Invisible Burden. We look at tourism demand, we look at product and service, and we look at how to spread the markets, in off-season or into rural areas, for example. But where we don't see any tourism planning happening now is under monitoring consumption of resources, or how to manage our most valuable assets. Our World Heritage sites tend to be undermanaged only because they don't have the financing they need. Or then, as part of that, how do we create a system of consistently using stakeholder and local citizen input to make sure we're hitting the targets? So what do we recommend? Well, we've been looking at this, and we think that it's not just more data, but very specific data is needed in order to guide the destinations of the future. And it cannot be just market demand. It has to be done in a shared fashion with municipalities, with indigenous nations, with utilities, and then some help potentially from academic partners to measure our sustainability benchmarks in destinations. And we tested this out via a overseas project to actually try the system of these types of measurements. We do have a framework that has been successfully tested. And so we are now moving into scaling that up and offering that, because we do believe this will be necessary to make tourism sustainable at the full scale of a destination in future. So how would this look in the recovery? Well, these are dynamic ideas that we came up with for our Marshall Plan for Tourism with the Asia Pacific region, the Pacific Asia Travel Association. We presented this in front of 40 preeminent thinkers and designers and financiers this past month. And here's what we are looking at: that we will need a sustainable tourism investment hub in order to channel financing. If it just goes to the pre-existing players, unfortunately, it will only finance the system we have. And so if we created a hub, then we could create these subcategories for the recovery with sustainable tourism. Say we had a sustainable tourism rural destination management fund, say in the Yukon or in Banff or whatever. That's the idea. Each one of these places also needs to look at their infrastructure to make sure it's meeting the needs of their tourists. And here's where you could introduce the data center and also the capacity building. We're recommending that a certificate becomes available for this. We're designing this together with the UNWTO as a downloadable system that could help to inform the next generation of destination managers. So, right, baby? So what are other nations doing? We had a look at that via the OECD's research. Slovenia is moving forward with some financing of their green tourism facilities and doing capacity building. And Iceland is a great model. They already started charging a small tax on every tourism entry, on which they had been reinvesting in their parks and protected areas, looking to improve their, say, electrification of their infrastructure in their harbors, and creating a technology development fund, which is exactly what we're talking about. It would be like a data hub for them to oversee the management of tourism growth. So the overall, structure of what we're recommending here is to be sure that the right infrastructure that is sustainable, that is looking at sustainable green transitions of energy, waste and wastewater. I remember we had a great discussion about that in Dawson, actually, as Blake knows, and the mayor was very interested in this, right? Yeah. At the same time, how are we going to get more finance? Say we have an infusion of funding from the Canadian government, but it will still have to be on the table how to maintain this in the long term. And we've looked at that. We can discuss it after I finish. And then how will we make this capacity building possible? As I said, it's been a focus of my work to make some of the research that we've done through Harvard and Cornell fully available via the UNWTO. So to wrap up, what we're trying to do here is actually restructure the governance of tourism, which is bold. But we think Canada could be a great place for this. It would actually foster the kind of innovation that young people that are coming out of tourism educations could really jump in more, especially on the data side. It would build a team approach with the folks that are already working on the market side, and ultimately build a more robust way of managing, say, private sector, public-private interactions, and create the potential of new financial pipelines that are really very sensitive to green transition and local needs. So all of this comes down to a need for coordination in the end. And the kind of coordination we have now is frankly not the coordination that we need for the future. So we look forward to your comments, and it's been great speaking with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. It's a lot of great information there, and I know that from the talk that you gave in Dawson last year, it's an ever evolving topic. So and something that is very pertinent to the industry. I'm wondering. So I just wanted to let people know. Just a reminder that the Incorporating Sustainability in Future Plans chat room. We're encouraging people to go to that chat room after this session if you'd like to kind of have more of an in-depth conversation about this with Megan. Also, there's been a lot of questions about the PowerPoint and whether it would be available on the website. We can coordinate with TIAC to make sure that the PowerPoint's available, just so people know that you can access it a little bit later. But going into some questions, Megan, I have a couple of questions for you before we start taking questions from the audience. One just comes to mind. You were talking about financing. So, how do we pay for all this? I think it's probably top of a lot of people's minds right now. So, do you have any advice, any thoughts about financing for these kinds of models?
Well, I see it in stages, right? The first stage, especially for the recovery, would be some kind of financial infusion as part of the recovery. But then, if you can get these, even in pilot form, established in a couple of provinces, right, then you can build it out. And the data centers that we designed for another country, but doesn't matter. The overall idea was to qualify them for green climate financing. There are it's billions and billions of dollars that are available for transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, for example. And I've been very avidly following that. But in order for cities or towns to qualify, they have to gather the data in order to get those infusions. Another thing is that private impact finance, which we've been following very closely, is growing enormously right now. It's outstripping by far the total amount of money that goes towards development bank finance, for example. So what I just finished a study for Harvard Business School on impact finance, and we're seeing that this travel and tourism area, while not big yet, again, like Dawson, I'll just use that, but we talked about it a lot. What if they did want to make the green transition? What if they did have a data center? Then they could actually organize it so that impact finance could come in as part of the destination hub. And we've been really interested in that is possible. We have been looking at the financier side of it. And so you see that the nations want to put in green climate money. You see private finance wanting to put in impact finance. And then there's also something called green bonds, which is another form of impact finance that's specifically set up for utilities. So there's a lot of potential if we have these hubs to organize the capacity to actually get, I'm talking serious finance, but you have to be qualified. Mhm.
No, there's a definitely interesting info there. And I know that when we were talking with this earlier too, two of the big components, to developing any kind of major strategy, we had talked about the importance of engaging municipal governments in this, just, because they're so close to the ground and a lot of this infrastructure is managed by them already. So, excellent point there. And also just the, in discussions with Keith at ITAC, the importance of including the Indigenous strategy as part of the overall plan too. Do you have any comments on those?
I do, especially when I was in British Columbia, I met with Frank Antoine, who is speaking now. I'm sorry that, they're actually doing their session while we are, but he was extremely interested in my talk and wanted to, for the Indigenous, the council or corporation, to talk about training. He had a bunch of young people with him at the British Columbia conference, and he turned to me and said, that, where are they going to get the training? And I said, well, it could be part of this same model where a hub was established, then this kind of certificate that we're designing with UNWTO together with Cornell, it could be downloaded, and that would be part of the overall hub concept.
One question, and this is for some, I know that there are people that have been involved in sustainable tourism for a while and some newcomers, but one thing I think that gets people confused, myself included, is, just the terminology and the language around sustainability. We have, sustainable tourism and responsible tourism and now regenerative tourism. And I think people are kind of probably wondering, how do I use this terminology? Like what so I guess, is there any advice you have about how to navigate that?
Well, yes. I think that the travel and tourism industry is very consumer focused, and therefore we like to inspire. So I never want to discourage people from inspiring people to be more responsible. But when it comes to actually measuring our impacts, the best term is sustainability. And that is because, again, if we operate in our own bubble that is separate from the international agreements for Paris or for the SDGs, we're basically isolating ourselves. And that's not good. And not to mention that if we really wanted to create a new, certifiable term on regenerative tourism, I would say that could take about 10 to 12 years. And I'm speaking from experience because I did that for ecotourism, leading an organization that led to an international year of ecotourism in which we were one of 3 partners. Yes, we got there. I do believe we have decent standards and guidelines for ecotourism. We would have to start that all over again for something called regenerative tourism. I think it's nothing wrong with marketing, but not when it comes to setting standards.
That's really, it's definitely good to know for sure.
Yeah.
Taking a couple of questions from the chat. I know that we have a few that have popped up here. One is, how do DMO CEOs get buy-in from their boards? What are the first steps?
That's a great question. I think that having, some presentations perhaps, it's a great idea. I mean, maybe we could do a standardized presentation, even coming from my collective colleagues, to share with DMOs. We're already working in Europe by way of some distribution of this kind of information through companies, frankly, that are working with the DMO. So if there were some kind of distribution network, there could be a workshop too. We've actually proposed that workshop to TIAC itself by way of doing a national workshop that could follow up on this. And they have made the proposal as part of a proposal for follow-up to this conference. And they said we won't know until January or February. But I think Blake and I have agreed from the beginning that we have to follow up on this event and see. A lot of this information has been very carefully vetted, as I hope you've seen, through other regional organizations. So we're happy to do that in Canada, and we hope that we can. Yeah.
Thanks, Megan. Another question. This one's coming from Destination Canada. So the question is, one thing I hear time and time again is that sustainable tourism equals tourism for the wealthy only. I'd be curious how Megan would counter that.
Huh. Well, I've heard that, but not all the time. It's interesting that you've heard that all the time. I think, that sustainable tourism has nothing to do with your income bracket. It may be the way it's been promoted in very fancy trips to Africa or something. But overall, I think in the continental North America, it could easily be equated with the reverse, which is going camping, right? So the overall approach to sustainability doesn't have to be expensive. That is without question. But at the same time, unless you have this kind of destination focused sustainability approach, it's more difficult to achieve a promise that you're achieving that, while a more expensive company might well have taken care of those costs, right? So that may be why people associate it with an expensive trip, but it doesn't have to be at all, as long as the destination is taking proper care of the location. Yeah.
I think that ties in a little bit with what we were talking about earlier too. I mean, just the shift from key performance indicator being, the volume of visitors as opposed to the visitor spend or the time that visitors spend in a destination as well too. I think that, we've been using a lot of measurements that kind of are decades old and don't really apply to the same degree that they used to. So I know that came up a lot last year when you were in Dawson as well.
Yeah, we try to keep it really simple, but science-based. That's something that we're changing, I think, as a field, that we can no longer just rely on good intentions. These have to be now, these metrics, because of the climate crisis especially, have to be science-based. So that's part of the process.
We've got time for, I think, one more question here. So for anybody who does have questions, we'd also encourage you to go to the chat after this, or just seek out Megan and I individually after this talk. There's a lot of information. We could probably spend a whole day on this topic, but we're definitely limited for time today. So there are a number of sustainable tourism destination accreditations. Is there one that you would recommend and why?
Well, we have not evaluated them enough to really give you an answer, and I have to say that because as a representative of two major research institutions, I really can't recommend one over another. But most of them are not science-based, and we are coming up with a new journal article, which we plan to put in sustainability that's based on our results on the need for that data management, those models of using data at the destination. Because if anything is, policy based, we already know that only 11% of countries that have policies for sustainability are actually implementing them in tourism. So we know that the policy based approach doesn't work. And so that's why we're advocating the science based.
We are out of time, but thank you, Megan, so much for your insights today. Thank you for everybody for joining us. Definitely the start of a conversation. Big thank you to TIAC for featuring this conversation today, and we look forward to talking with you further during the program. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Blake.
Thank you for joining us for this TIAC talk. Did you know that networking continues even after the end of today's sessions? Don't forget to save time to catch up with your colleagues from coast to coast to coast. N'oubliez pas de réserver du temps pour vous rattraper avec vos collègues d'un océan à l'autre.